Hello friends and confidants in pursuit of humanity's lost memory. Today, we dive into the vast and unexplained 290,000-year gap between the emergence of Homo sapiens and the invention of writing. Our lives have been shaped not only by the records of the last 10,000 years, but also by the whispers of these dark ages. During this immense period, did we merely hunt, or did we build great civilizations whose traces have been erased? What strikes you most when you think about this mysterious era? It's always a pleasure to read your comments. What if we did not just sit in caves for hundreds of thousands of years? What if humanity actually reached incredible heights only to have the slate wiped completely clean, leaving us as a species with collective amnesia? Before we search the ocean floor or the stars for lost empires, we have to look in the mirror, because the greatest piece of evidence that a massive chapter is missing is sitting right inside your skull. Let us begin. Think for a long, quiet moment about the physical structure of your own brain. As you lie there, resting your head, consider the absolute marvel of biological engineering resting just beneath the bone of your skull. It is an intricate, deeply folded mass of soft tissue containing roughly 86 billion neurons. Those neurons are firing right now in brilliantly complex, cascading patterns, allowing you to decode the subtle vibrations of my voice, to construct vivid, moving images in the dark theater of your mind, and to ponder the vast, empty stretches of human history. Your frontal lobe grants you the extraordinary ability to plan for a future that does not yet exist, to worry about tomorrow, to dream of next year. Your cerebral cortex holds a nearly infinite capacity for complex language, for the abstract rules of mathematics, for deep, overwhelming empathy, and for the creation of breathtaking art. We, sitting here in the 21st century, like to think of this brain as the ultimate finished product of the modern world. It is the crown jewel of our advanced civilization. We naturally assume that because we build towering skyscrapers of glass and steel, because we launch satellites into the cold vacuum of space, and because we program quantum computers, our brains must be fundamentally, biologically superior to those of the people who lived in the distant, shadowy past. But this is an illusion. It is a comforting, arrogant lie that we tell ourselves to make our standard timeline make sense. The startling, undeniable truth of human anatomy is that your brain is not new. It is not an upgrade unique to the modern era. If we were to somehow travel back in time, slipping quietly through the centuries, fading past the fall of the Roman Empire, drifting past the raising of the great Egyptian pyramids, moving past the very first agricultural settlements in the ancient river valleys, and if we were to keep going backwards for 300,000 years, we would find people walking the earth who looked exactly perfectly like us. Imagine it. If you were to somehow take a newborn infant from a nomadic hunter-gatherer tribe living 300,000 years ago and bring that child through a portal into the present day, raising them in a modern suburban home, they would be completely indistinguishable from any other modern person you pass on the street. They would not be primitive. They would not be lacking in any cognitive capacity. That child could learn to speak 3 different languages fluently. They could sit at a grand piano and master complex sweeping symphonies. They could study advanced astrophysics, write complex computer code, and navigate the digital landscape with the exact same effortless, intuitive grace that you do. They possessed the exact same biological hardware. The capacity for sheer, unadulterated genius was already fully formed, lying beautifully dormant inside their minds. They had the same deep, bottomless well of human emotions. They felt crushing grief when they lost a loved one to the harshness of the wild. They felt warm, radiant joy sitting in the morning sun, and they surely looked up at the endless, glittering canopy of the night sky and wondered with deep philosophical dread about their tiny place in the universe. They were us. We are them. But if they had the exact same perfect biological hardware as us, why did they not write anything down? What locked their brilliant minds away in the dark for hundreds of thousands of years? To even begin to understand the depth of this mystery, we must look much closer at what they actually did with those brilliant minds. For a very long time, dusty textbooks painted our ancient ancestors as simple, brutish creatures, stumbling blindly through the wilderness, grunting, and occasionally hitting things with blunt rocks. But the archaeological record reveals a level of primitive genius that is almost frightening when you truly slow down to think about it. Consider the mastery of fire and the painstaking creation of complex stone tools. We often dismiss a stone, arrowhead, or a hand axe in a museum display as a crude, primitive object. But imagine trying to make one yourself, sitting in the dirt with nothing but the raw materials of the earth. It is not a matter of simply smashing two rocks together until one magically becomes sharp. The creation of a refined stone tool requires an intense, deeply intellectual, and highly coordinated process known as flint knapping. It requires an advanced, intuitive understanding of fracture mechanics. The ancient toolmaker must look at a raw, unbroken piece of flint and see the finished razor-sharp blade hidden inside it. Much like a sculptor sees the statue inside a block of marble, they must plan out a sequence of strikes from highly specific angles using precise calculated amounts of force, understanding exactly how the invisible shock wave of the blow will travel through the dense molecular structure of the stone. A millimeter of miscalculation and the entire tool shatters into useless dust. Even more astonishing is the physical evidence that these ancient humans were using thermal engineering. They were using heat treatment to deliberately alter the fundamental physical properties of the stone. They realized through careful systematic observation that if they buried certain specific types of rock beneath the glowing red coals of a fire, heating them to highly specific temperatures for measured precise amounts of time, the internal crystalline structure of the stone would permanently change. It would become significantly easier to flake, allowing for much sharper, much more delicate and deadly edges. Think about the profound intelligence required for this. They had to know exactly how hot the fire was without a thermometer. They had to know exactly how long to wait, measuring time without a clock. They were running scientific experiments. They were passing down this accumulated, highly technical knowledge from generation to generation, whispering the complex secrets of the stones around ancient campfires, preserving a verbal encyclopedia of survival. Heating stone to the exact precise temperature is not a raw animal instinct. It is material science. It is chemistry and physics applied in the wild. But if they understood the fundamental principles of material science, if they had the intellect to manipulate the molecular structure of the earth itself, why did they stop at stone and never progress to metal? The mystery only deepens when we step away from the warmth of the campfire and move into the deep, echoing, absolute silence of the caves for hundreds of thousands of years. These anatomically modern humans lived deeply nomadic lives, following the shifting seasons, tracking the great herds of massive animals across endless, untouched, wild landscapes. But they did not just survive, they observed. They felt a profound need to express their understanding of the world, and eventually they began to leave marks. Imagine walking into a deep limestone cave in southern France or deep within the islands of Indonesia. You step out of the bright, harsh daylight and into the cool, damp, heavy darkness. The rich smell of wet earth, old dust, and ancient minerals fills the still air. You hold up a flickering torch made of animal fat and bound grasses. The warm golden light dances and stretches across the uneven rock walls, casting long, moving shadows. And there, illuminated by that shifting light, is an absolute masterpiece. Majestic wild horses, massive, heavily muscled bison, and leaping deer painted with crushed red ochre, black charcoal, and natural binders. The proportions of the animals are utterly perfect. The artists used the natural sweeping curves and bulges of the cave wall itself to give the animals a stunning three-dimensional illusion. When the torchlight flickers, the animals seem to breathe. They seem to move in the dark. These were not random scribbles of a child. They were deliberate, soulful, masterful expressions of a people who were intimately, spiritually connected to the world around them. And their creativity was not limited to the walls of hidden caves. Archaeologists have sifted through the ancient dirt and found tiny, delicate snail shells and animal teeth, pierced with impossibly small, perfectly round holes. These were designed to be strung together and worn as beads on a necklace. Creating a necklace of tiny shells serves absolutely no practical survival purpose. It does not keep you warm in the freezing winter. It does not feed your hungry children. It does not protect you from the sharp teeth of a predator. It takes hours, perhaps days of painstaking, highly focused, and entirely unnecessary manual labor to drill a hole through a fragile shell without shattering it, which means these ancient people cared deeply about beauty. They cared about personal identity, about social status, about belonging to a tribe, and about art for the sake of art. It means they had free time. They were not constantly running for their lives or starving. They had the leisure time to sit quietly and create beautiful things simply because they wanted to. They possessed complex social structures, deep spiritual beliefs, and the profound ability to think abstractly about their own existence. They had art, they had abstract thought, they had leisure time. Yet tens of thousands of years passed and not a single brick was placed on top of another. Why? The standard, comfortable, reassuring answer provided by conventional history textbooks is that they simply did not have the right environmental conditions. We are taught that humanity was just waiting for the last ice age to finally end, waiting for the global climate to warm and stabilize, waiting for someone somewhere to have the sudden, brilliant, world-changing idea of planting a single seed in the moist ground, thus inventing agriculture, securing a stable food supply, and starting the slow, inevitable march towards civilization. We are repeatedly told that hunter-gatherers were trapped in an endless, exhausting cycle of finding food, completely unable to settle down in one place and build permanent structures. But as we look closer at the evidence, this explanation is beginning to look incredibly fragile, almost insulting to our ancestors. Hunter-gatherers were the supreme ultimate observers of nature. Their very lives depended on a flawless understanding of the world around them. They knew exactly how plants grew. They understood the subtle shifting of the seasons better than any modern meteorologist. They knew the precise cycles of the moon, the slow, majestic rotation of the constellations across the night sky. They memorized the invisible migration patterns of birds across vast continents, and they knew the exact blooming times of every single edible root, berry, and medicinal leaf in their vast territories. To suggest that humans with brains absolutely identical to ours simply failed to notice that seeds, turn into plants for 290,000 years is an insult to their profound intelligence. They knew exactly how seeds worked. They understood plant biology. They knew, but they did not build. Perhaps it was a conscious philosophical choice. Perhaps the free nomadic life was simply a better, healthier, and far more sustainable way to live. And they actively, deliberately chose not to tie themselves to a single patch of dirt, refusing to break their backs, toiling in fields when the world provided abundantly for those who knew how to move. But there is another, much more unsettling hypothesis lingering in the shadows of prehistory. What if the lack of permanent progress was not a conscious choice at all? And what if it was certainly not a lack of intelligence? What if they were trapped not by the biological limits of their own minds, but by an external, physical world that was aggressively, violently, and relentlessly hostile to any attempt at permanence? Imagine a world where the climate does not shift gradually and peacefully over gentle millennia, but violently and unpredictably over mere decades. Imagine ancient generations trying desperately to establish settlements, trying to accumulate knowledge, trying to build something that lasts longer than a single lifetime, only to have it repeatedly, ruthlessly scoured from the face of the earth by forces entirely beyond their control. Imagine massive continent drowning floods. Imagine sudden, terrifying plunges into glacial cold that turn green valleys into frozen wastelands in a matter of years. Imagine supervolcanic eruptions that tear the sky apart, filling the atmosphere with choking ash and completely blocking out the life-giving light of the sun for years at a time. What if the 290,000-year gap in our history is not an empty, quiet waiting room? What if it is instead a massive, silent graveyard of forgotten attempts? What if our brilliant, capable ancestors were constantly pushed to the very brink of utter annihilation, forced to abandon their beautiful creations, forced to forget their accumulated knowledge, and forced to regress to the absolute basics of raw survival over and over and over again? The conventional timeline tells us that humanity was simply waiting for the right conditions to build civilization. But our DNA tells a much darker story. A story not of waiting, but of near extinction. To truly understand the depth of our forgotten history, we must travel back to a time when the earth was violently unforgiving. Picture the world roughly 74,000 years ago. Human populations, small but profoundly intelligent, were scattered across various continents. They had their languages, their carefully crafted tools, their deeply held spiritual beliefs, and their intimate understanding of the natural world. They were surviving, and in many places they were thriving. The skies were clear. The great herds of animals roamed the vast plains, and the slow, steady rhythm of ancient life pulsed across the globe. And then, in a single catastrophic geological moment, that rhythm simply stopped, deep beneath what is now the island of Sumatra in Indonesia. A reservoir of unimaginable pressure had been building for thousands of years. When Mount Toba finally erupted, it did not just reshape the local landscape. It fractured the very atmosphere of the planet. It was a supervolcanic event categorized as one of the largest and most violently explosive eruptions in the last 2 million years of Earth's history. The explosion ejected thousands of cubic kiln of pulverized rock, toxic sulfur dioxide, and dense choking ash high into the stratosphere. Imagine looking up at the sky wherever you were in the world and watching the sun slowly fade away. It did not return the next day, nor the next week. The massive cloud of volcanic ash spread like a suffocating blanket across the globe, catching the high-altitude winds and wrapping the earth in a shroud of deep, unnatural twilight. This was the beginning of the Great Volcanic Winter. The temperature of the planet plummeted dramatically. In a matter of months, regions that were once lush and temperate turned bitterly cold. Snow and ice began to fall in places that never known winter. The ash rained down continuously, covering the forests, the plains, and the ancient lakes in a thick, grey, silent layer of dust. Without the warming rays of the sun, the vast forests began to wither. The rich vegetation that supported the massive herds of grazing animals died off, turning the world into a barren, freezing wasteland. And as the plants died, the great beasts starved. And as the beasts starved, the apex predators, including our brilliant ancestors, found themselves facing a darkness they could not outrun. The sky was completely blocked. The bitter volcanic winter lasted for years, perhaps even decades. The vegetation slowly, inevitably died off. How did a creature without thick, heavy fur, without sharp defensive claws, and without the ability to hibernate, survive when even the massive, powerful beasts of the earth fell to the cold? The grim reality is that for the most part, they did not survive. The freezing dark claimed them. When modern geneticists look deeply into the microscopic winding structures of human DNA, they are looking at a living biological history book. By measuring the genetic variation between different populations alive today, scientists can accurately reconstruct the size of ancient human populations. And when they look back to the era immediately following the Toba supereruption, they see something that is deeply terrifying. They see a genetic bottleneck. A genetic bottleneck occurs when a species suffers a catastrophic drop in numbers, a die-off so severe that the vast majority of its genetic diversity is permanently wiped off the face of the earth. If you compare humans to chimpanzees, our closest living primate relatives, you will find a shocking paradox. Even though there are billions of humans covering the globe today, and only a small handful of chimpanzees living in isolated patches of forest, the chimpanzees have vastly more genetic diversity than we do. We are all incredibly, unnervingly similar at the genetic level, and there is only one reason for this. It is because roughly 74,000 years ago, nearly everyone died. Mathematical models based on our DNA suggest that the global human population crashed. It plummeted from tens of thousands of thriving, scattered groups down to a terrifyingly small number. Some estimates suggest that the effective breeding population of the entire human species dropped to as few as 3,000 to 10,000 individuals worldwide. Imagine the sheer emptiness of the planet. 10,000 people. That is fewer people than you would find in a modern, small, suburban town or a single neighborhood in a large city. And those 10,000 individuals were not living together in a cozy community. They were scattered across the massive, freezing continents, broken into tiny, isolated bands of exhausted, starving survivors, huddled around fading fires in the absolute dark. They were the last flickering embers of humanity, surrounded by an endless frozen graveyard. The entire human population of the planet was smaller than a modern small town. You must ask yourself, how many warm fires of ancient knowledge, how many brilliant hard-won inventions, and how many beautiful spoken languages were permanently, irreversibly extinguished alongside the people who perished in that long, bitter winter. When a population crashes so violently, the loss is not just measured in flesh and bone. The true tragedy is the catastrophic loss of accumulated culture. In a hunter-gatherer society, there are no libraries. There are no written manuals or digital hard drives to preserve information. Every single piece of knowledge, how to find hidden water in a drought, how to safely prepare certain medicinal roots, the complex stories of the stars, The exact temperature required to heat-treat stone lives only in the delicate, fragile minds of the living. When the elders died of the cold, their lifetime of wisdom vanished like smoke in the wind. When the master toolmakers starved, their sophisticated techniques were buried with them under the volcanic ash. If humanity had been on the verge of some great technological breakthrough, if they had been experimenting with early agriculture, or building the first rudimentary, permanent structures, or organizing into larger, more complex societies, that progress was utterly annihilated. The Toba bottleneck acted as a brutal, indiscriminate reset button on human development. The survivors were stripped of their cultural wealth, forced to abandon their art and their innovations, reduced to focusing every ounce of their brilliant minds on finding the next meal and staying warm for just one more freezing night. But within this tragic story of near extinction lies the very secret to our eventual dominion over the earth. The 10,000 people who made it through the long winter were not simply lucky. They were the absolute masters of survival. The bottleneck created an environment of extreme, unforgiving natural selection. The cold, the dark, and the famine ruthlessly weeded out the inflexible and the frail. Those who survived were the ones possessing the most extraordinary problem-solving skills. They were the ones who could look at a barren, snow-covered landscape and figure out how to extract calories from it. They were the ones who could adapt their hunting strategies to catch entirely new types of prey. More importantly, they were the ones who knew how to cooperate. In a world actively trying to kill you, selfishness is a death sentence. The survivors were the tribes that bonded together tightly, the ones who shared their meager rations, who cared for their sick, and who communicated most effectively. The genetic bottlenecks squeezed humanity through a crucible of ice and ash. And what emerged on the other side was a highly refined, intensely social, and stunningly intelligent creature. You carry their genes right now. The resilience required to survive the end of the world is woven into the very fabric of your being. This unimaginable catastrophe did not make us weaker. It forced us to evolve our intellect and our capacity for cooperation to their absolute limits. But when the thick clouds of ash finally began to clear, when the ice slowly melted and the world warmed again, where did these genius minds go to start over? The recovery was not instantaneous. It took thousands of years for the Earth to heal from the wounds of the supervolcano. Slowly, the sunlight pierced through the thinning haze of the stratosphere. Slowly, the resilient seeds buried deep in the soil began to sprout, reaching for the returning warmth. The forest began to slowly creep back across the plains, and the surviving animals began to multiply and spread out once more. And the humans, those hardened, brilliant survivors, began to move. They emerged from their deep caves, from the isolated, warm, equatorial valleys that had served as their sanctuaries. They stepped out into a world that felt vast, empty, and newly reborn. But they were deeply changed. They carried the ancestral trauma of the Great Dying. They knew on a profound instinctual level that the world could turn against them in an instant. They needed security. They needed resources that were completely reliable. Food sources that would not simply vanish if the climate suddenly shifted again. Hunting great land mammals was dangerous. And as the climate fluctuated, the herds were notoriously unreliable. So, the survivors began to follow the water. They moved along the winding paths of the great rivers, where the fresh water provided a constant, steady supply of fish and where the riverbanks supported lush, edible vegetation regardless of the broader climate. They followed these rivers for generations, migrating slowly, season by season, decade by decade. And eventually those rivers led them all to the same destination. They followed the flowing water until it met the endless crashing waves of the sea. The coastlines offered an absolute bounty of survival. The oceans were teeming with live shellfish that could be easily gathered from the tide pools, kelp forests rich in nutrients, and fish that could be caught with simple nets and spears woven from coastal grasses. The climate near the massive bodies of water was naturally moderated, keeping the winters warmer and the summers cooler. It was a paradise for a species that had just barely survived a frozen apocalypse. And so humanity became a species deeply, fundamentally tied to the edges of the water. They stopped wandering aimlessly across the harsh, unpredictable interiors of the continents. And they began to settle, to put down roots in the soft, sandy soils of the world's coastlines. They built their fires on the beaches. They crafted better tools from the bones of marine mammals. And they began once again to look up at the stars and wonder. They had the brains. They had the resources. And finally, they had the stability to begin building the foundations of what we might call civilization. But the history books do not show us these magnificent coastal settlements. We do not have museums filled with their early coastal architecture or their fishing vessels. And there is a devastatingly simple, profoundly geological reason for that absence. The survivors inherited a broken, frozen world. And when they finally moved, they did not just spread across the land. They settled on coastlines that no longer exist. To fully grasp the staggering magnitude of what has been lost to the tides of time, we must fundamentally completely alter the way we look at the map of our world. When you look at a brightly colored modern globe today, you see the familiar, comforting shapes of the continents, separated by vast, unbroken expanses of deep blue ocean. We naturally, instinctively assume that the borders between the dry land and the deep sea have always been exactly where they are right now. We view the coastlines as permanent, unyielding boundaries. But the earth is not a static painting hanging in a museum. It is a restless, shifting, heavily breathing, living system. And during the long, bitter millennia of the last ice age, the face of the earth looked entirely, unimaginably different. During this prolonged period, the global climate was locked in a deep planetary freeze. Unimaginable, staggering quantities of the Earth's water were continuously evaporating from the surface of the oceans, carried by the winds, and falling as endless silent snow across the northern and southern hemispheres. But because of the bitter cold, that snow never melted. Year after year, century after century, it accumulated. Over thousands of years, this packed snow compressed into massive towering continental ice sheets. These glaciers were not just thin sheets of ice. They were colossal, unimaginably heavy mountains of frozen water, stretching for thousands upon thousands of miles and reaching heights of over 2 meters straight up into the pale sky. Because so much of the planet's total water supply was physically, solidly locked away in these massive frozen structures resting heavily on the land, the liquid water levels in the oceans began to drop. They did not drop by a few mere inches or a few easily manageable feet. The global sea levels dropped by an astonishing world-altering 400 feet. That is more than 120 meters of vertical ocean simply removed from the coastlines. Imagine for a long moment standing on your favorite modern beach, looking out at the rhythmic crashing waves. Now close your eyes and imagine the water steadily receding. Not just a temporary low tide, but a permanent massive retreat. The water pulls back so incredibly far that the wet sandy beach you are standing on slowly dries out and becomes a high, elevated inland plateau. To reach the new edge of the crashing ocean, you would have to walk for days, perhaps even weeks, trekking across a vast, newly exposed continental shelf. millions upon millions of square miles of prime, incredibly fertile virgin land was suddenly brought out from the darkness of the sea and into the open air. This new land was not a salty desert. Over time, it was crisscrossed by winding crystal-clear freshwater rivers, dotted with deep, tranquil lakes, and completely shielded from the harsh, freezing inland climates by the natural warming, moderation of the distant sea. For the ancient human tribes who had miraculously survived the great dying of the volcanic winter, these vast, newly exposed coastlines were an absolute, undeniable paradise. They were the perfect places to heal, to gather strength, to invent, and to finally build. They settled there. They thrived there in the gentle coastal breezes. Think about this carefully and let the sheer scale of the implication settle into your mind. Over 40% of the entire global human population today lives directly on a coastline. If the oceans were to suddenly catastrophically rise 400 feet tomorrow, our entire modern civilization, our greatest, most vibrant cities, our global financial hubs, our most sacred historical monuments would vanish completely and silently beneath the crushing waves. So, what exactly vanished 11,000 years ago? When the towering glaciers finally began to melt at the end of the last ice age, the oceans did not just rise peacefully. They reclaimed their lost territory with absolute ruthless and terrifying finality. The lands that sank beneath the advancing waves were not just narrow, insignificant strips of beach. They were entire massive land masses, whole worlds unto themselves that simply ceased to exist. Consider a place that modern marine geologists now call Doggerland. Today, the United Kingdom is an island completely separated from the rest of continental Europe by the cold, grey, churning waters of the North Sea. But for tens of thousands of years, there was absolutely no sea there at all. Britain was firmly, solidly connected to the European continent by a massive, sprawling expanse of dry land roughly the size of modern-day France. This was Doggerland. It was not a barren, frozen wasteland. It was a rich, beautifully undulating landscape of gently rolling green hills, dense, shadowy ancient oak forests, and sprawling, nutrient-rich marshlands. It was a hunter's absolute paradise, teeming with massive migrating herds of woolly mammoths, giant ancient deer with towering antlers, and wild untamed horses sweeping across the plains. And humanity was there. They lived there for countless unrecorded generations. They hunted among those dense trees. They built their warm, flickering fires by those vanished freshwater rivers. They buried their dead in that soft earth. And they inevitably left the physical traces of their complex lives behind. Halfway across the world, an even larger, more magnificent landmass suffered the exact same watery, silent fate. In Southeast Asia, the shallow, warm waters that now separate the thousands of islands of Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines simply did not exist. They were all physically connected in a colossal, continuous, sprawling superpeninsula known as Sunderland. This was an area twice the size of modern India, featuring a deeply warm, humid, tropical climate, unimaginably dense rainforests, and some of the most complex, highly biodiverse ecosystems on the face of the planet. It was an environment perfectly, flawlessly suited for rapid human expansion, deep cultural development, and early permanent settlement. But when the long ice age finally broke and the ice melted, the water returned with a slow, unstoppable vengeance. The rising seas swallowed Doggerland completely, turning its rolling green hills and ancient oak forests into the dark, muddy, freezing floor of the North Sea. The ocean poured relentlessly over Sun, drowning millions of square miles of steaming tropical forests and isolating the highest mountain peaks, which we now know today as the scattered islands of Southeast Asia. Whatever our brilliant ancestors built on those vast fertile plains, whether they were simple, temporary hunting camps, or the very first brilliant attempts at permanent structured villages, or perhaps something even more complex and deeply unimaginable to us, was entirely swallowed by the sea. It was drowned in cold, unforgiving salt water and buried deep under thousands of years of accumulated marine sediment, lost to the absolute darkness. Yet the sea is not a perfect vault. Occasionally, it gives us brief, haunting, and incredibly disruptive glimpses of what lies hidden beneath its surface. Heavy industrial commercial fishing trawlers dragging their massive weighted nets across the deep, dark, freezing floor of the North Sea occasionally pull up something that absolutely does not belong in the ocean. Mixed in with the struggling silverfish, the tangles of dark green seaweed, and the mud, the fishermen find ancient, perfectly carved bone harpoons. They find meticulously shaped flint axes, polished smooth by human hands thousands of years ago. They even pull up the massive, heavy, fossilized bones of mammoths and cave lions that once walked proudly on dry land where the ships now sail. If a random fishing net dragged completely blindly in the pitch-black darkness, hundreds of feet below the churning surface, and can accidentally snag and pull up the physical remnants of an ancient human life, then how many sprawling prehistoric cities, how many lost monuments are lying perfectly silent in the crushing dark down there? The great frustrating paradox of this historical mystery lies in the deeply, aggressively hostile nature of the ocean itself. When we ask reasonably why archaeologists have not simply found grand, sweeping, undeniable evidence of these drowned coastal civilizations, we must deeply understand the absolute terrifying nightmare that is underwater archaeology. The ocean is not a museum. It is the ultimate hungry destroyer. It is not a gentle preservative that keeps things safe for us to find later. Salt water is highly, relentlessly corrosive. The constant grinding, endless action of deep-sea currents acts like heavy sandpaper over the millennia, slowly and inevitably wearing away even the hardest, most durable stone. Microscopic marine organisms bore relentlessly into sunken wood and ancient bone, completely dissolving and digesting organic materials until absolutely nothing remains but memory. If an ancient coastal culture built their homes and their temples out of wood, woven reeds, tightly packed earth, or sun-baked, as almost all early known cultures did, the hungry ocean would have entirely erased every single physical trace of their existence within a matter of a few short centuries. They would simply melt back into the mud of the seafloor. Even if they possessed the incredible foresight and the organizational power to build with massive, heavy blocks of stone, finding them is nearly a statistical impossibility. The flooded continental shelves are unimaginably vast, stretching for millions of square miles, and the water covering them is deep, eternally dark, and often incredibly dangerous. Underwater archaeology is not like digging in the dry sand of a desert. It requires highly specialized, incredibly expensive technological equipment, tens of millions of dollars in funding, and tremendous life-threatening physical risk to the human divers who venture down into the crushing pressure. Visibility at those immense depths is often severely reduced by swirling sediment to a few murky, terrifying feet. A diver could be swimming a mere 10 yards away from the greatest, most paradigm-shifting archaeological discovery in human history, and never even see its shadow through the impenetrable green gloom. because of this intense, almost insurmountable physical and financial difficulty. The vast, overwhelming majority of our historical funding, our academic effort, and our scientific attention is focused entirely on the dry land. We dig where it is relatively easy. We search the arid deserts, the accessible river valleys, and the dry open plains completely, stubbornly, ignoring the glaring geographical fact that the most valuable, prime, and highly sought-after real estate for ancient human settlement is currently resting quietly under hundreds of feet of heavy dark water. We have mapped the dry, lifeless, silent surface of the moon in far greater, more meticulous, and more intimate detail than we have mapped the bottom of our own life-giving oceans on Earth. The absence of evidence in this particular case is absolutely not the evidence of absence. But is there anything out there massive enough? Anything built with such colossal ambition and heavy enduring stone that even the deep hungry sea could not completely swallow and digest it? As we very slowly begin to push our advanced sonar technology deeper into the dark coastal waters of the world, strange, impossible shapes are beginning to emerge from the digital static, whispering anomalies that simply should not exist according to the standard comforting timeline of human history. Off the southern coast of Yonani, a small, remote, beautifully rugged island in Japan, the ocean floor drops away sharply into deep, swirling, shark-infested waters. In the late 1980s, a local diver exploring the area, searching for underwater formations, stumbled upon a massive, terrifyingly geometric rock structure resting quietly just below the turbulent surface. As he swam closer, his heart pounding in his chest, the murky blue water slowly revealed something that looked entirely, shockingly out of place in the chaotic, curving natural world of the sea. It was a colossal, heavily terraced, stepped structure stretching for hundreds of feet across the ocean floor. It features perfectly flat, sweeping platforms, sharp, unmistakable 90 right angles and long, perfectly straight edges that look exactly as though they have been precisely cut and shaped by massive, heavy tools. It looks uncannily, undeniably like a sunken, ancient stepped pyramid, eerily similar to the ziggurats of ancient Mesopotamia or the temples of the Americas. Geologists and archaeologists argue endlessly and sometimes bitterly about its true origins. Many conservative academics claim it is simply a bizarre, highly unusual, but completely natural geological formation, created by the natural fracturing of sandstone in a highly active tectonic fault zone over millions of years. But other researchers, looking at the exact same stones, point to the seemingly carved, perfectly parallel staircases, the imposing twin pillars standing like sentinels, and the perfect geometric symmetry of the terraces, arguing fiercely that blind nature does not build in perfect right angles. If the massive Yunani monument is indeed man-made, it was carved when that specific piece of land was high and dry above the water well over 10,000 years ago, long before the first pharaohs ruled Egypt. And Yononi is not the only ghost haunting the deep. Far away in the murky, turbulent waters of the Gulf of Kut, off the western coast of India, deep water acoustic sonar surveys revealed something even more startling, something that sent shockwaves through the archaeological community. The acoustic sonar images bouncing, sound waves off the hidden ocean floor painted a digital picture of perfectly straight, intersecting lines spread across a massive area of the seabed, resting over 120 feet below the crashing surface waves. The sonar clearly revealed large rectangular shapes, uniform, repeating foundations, and massive structures that look exactly, remarkably, like the sprawling ruins of a massive, heavily populated, well-planned, grid-like ancient city. When researchers sent dredgers down into the darkness to pull up material from the site, they pulled up pieces of ancient fired pottery, fragments of what appeared to be human construction material, and heavily fossilized human remains. Carbon dating of the wooden artifacts brought up from the depths suggested they were over 9,000 years old. If this dating holds true, if those structures are what they appear to be, it means a highly sophisticated, densely populated urban civilization existed on the coast of India, thousands of years before the first known cities of Mesopotamia or Egypt were ever conceived in the minds of men. It means the true cradle of human civilization was not a dusty inland river valley, as we have always been taught, but a vibrant, thriving coastline that was brutally silently swallowed by the rising sea at the end of the Ice Age. These underwater anomalies sit quietly in the absolute dark, heavily encrusted with white barnacles, draped in swaying seaweed, and wrapped in eternal silence. They remain fiercely debated, highly controversial, and desperately, tragically underexplored. Mainstream science is understandably hesitant to completely tear up and rewrite the entire established history of human civilization based on blurry sonar blips and ambiguous submerged rocks. And perhaps they are right to be cautious. To change the story of who we are, we need absolute, undeniable physical proof that we can touch with our own hands in the light of day. We cannot easily drain the oceans to find what was lost, but sometimes the earth forgets to hide its secrets. In 1994, a single hillside in Turkey shattered the timeline of human history forever. Picture the dry, rolling landscape of southeastern Turkey near the border of Syria. It is a region baked by the relentless sun, characterized by golden plains and dusty horizons that stretch out under an endless pale blue sky. For generations upon generations, local farmers walked their flocks of sheep across a gently sloping, entirely unremarkable ridge known as Potbelly Hill, or in the local tongue, Gobasi. Occasionally, the wooden ploughs of the farmers would snag on large buried blocks of limestone. For decades, passing academics and archaeologists dismissed the site, assuming it was simply an abandoned medieval cemetery or a crumbling outpost from the Byzantine era. It looked like nothing more than a natural accumulation of dirt and forgotten stone. But Klaus Schmidt, a deeply intuitive and patient German archaeologist, saw something completely different in the shape of that hill. He noticed that the rounded top of the mound did not look entirely natural. It looked too deliberate, too perfectly constructed to be a mere geological accident. Guided by a profound, nagging instinct, Schmidt began to dig into the dry, tightly packed earth. What he slowly uncovered beneath the dust of Potbelly Hill would completely break the accepted science of archaeology. It would shatter the comforting, linear story of human progress that we have all been taught since childhood. As the workers carefully brushed away the ancient dirt, massive, impossibly huge structures began to emerge into the harsh sunlight. They were not finding small, primitive tools or the scattered remnants of a simple hunter-gatherer camp. They were unearthing colossal, perfectly carved, T-shaped pillars made of solid, heavy limestone. These pillars were arranged in grand, sweeping, perfectly geometric circles, and they were absolutely massive. Some of the towering stone pillars stood over 18 feet tall, and they were heavy, unimaginably heavy. A single pillar at Göbekli weighs up to 16 tons. That is the equivalent weight of 3 modern, fully loaded commercial trucks, compressed into a single, towering block of solid rock. The physical reality of moving these stones is staggering to consider. These massive blocks had to be quarried from the solid bedrock of a limestone plateau situated a quarter of a mile away. You must try to visualize the sheer back-breaking human effort required. These supposedly primitive nomadic people had to carve out 16 tons of solid stone using only smaller, harder stones. They had no metal chisels. They had no iron picks. They had to patiently, endlessly pound and scrape away at the bedrock until the massive pillar was free. And then they had to move it. They had to transport 16 tons of dead weight across a quarter of a mile of uneven terrain up the slope of the hill and then lift it perfectly upright into a carved socket in the bedrock so that it stood perfectly, miraculously balanced. They did this not just once, but dozens and dozens of times. Ground-penetrating radar reveals that there are at least 200 of these massive pillars still buried inside the hill, forming at least 20 distinct, massive circular temples. But the true shock, the absolute paradigm anomaly that made the academic world stop breathing, was the dating of the site. When researchers tested the organic materials trapped in the mortar and the surrounding soil, the results were so old that many scientists simply refused to believe them at first. 11,600,000 years old. That means it was built 6,000 years before the Great Circle of Stonehenge. 7,000 years before the massive blocks of the Egyptian pyramids were laid by people who supposedly had absolutely no concept of agriculture. How does a small roaming band of hunters move 16 tons of solid rock without the invention of the wheel? The mystery deepens profoundly when we look closer at the surface of these impossible stones. Once the massive pillars were dragged into place and stood upright, the work of these ancient builders had only just begun. These were not rough, unhoneyed blocks of primitive rock. They were highly polished, perfectly smooth, and decorated with a level of artistic mastery that completely defies their age. Running your hand across the cool, shaded surface of the limestone, you would feel intricate, incredibly detailed bas-relief carvings. The ancient artists carved elaborate, menacing images of the local wildlife into the hard stone. There are giant spiders, scorpions, aggressive wild boars with beard tusks, leaping foxes, cranes, and massive looming vultures. What makes these carvings so extraordinary is the technique. The artists did not simply scratch the outlines of animals into the flat surface of the rock. They carved away the entire surrounding surface of the pillar, leaving the animals protruding outwards in stunning high-definition three-dimensional relief. The animals seemed to physically leap out from the stone. To achieve this effect using only flint tools requires an unimaginable investment of time, a flawless understanding of artistic proportion, and the patient, steady hand of a master sculptor. One single mistake, one misplaced strike of the flint, and the entire 16-tenon canvas is permanently ruined. Furthermore, the architecture of Gibiklit is far more sophisticated than a simple circle of standing stones. The builders created perfect concentric rings. They laid down beautifully smooth terrazzo floors made of burnt lime, a complex chemical process that requires heating limestone to extremely high, sustained temperatures. And then there are the acoustic properties. Acoustic engineers who have studied the ancient circular structures have discovered that the enclosures are designed to perfectly manipulate sound waves. If you were to stand in the center of one of these rings and speak or chant or strike a drum, the sound would hit the smoothly carved surfaces of the T-shaped pillars and perfectly resonate, creating an echoing, deeply hypnotic acoustic chamber. The low-frequency vibrations would bounce off the walls, amplifying and harmonizing, creating a physical sensation that you could feel vibrating deep within your chest. This level of architectural and acoustic planning completely destroys the idea that this was built by a disorganized group of cavemen who simply decided to stack some rocks. You do not accidentally build a perfectly resonating, mathematically precise acoustic chamber out of 16-ton megaliths. This was not a random lucky attempt. This level of architecture demands the careful accumulation of highly specialized knowledge passed down across multiple unrecorded generations. If they were simply primitive nomadic gatherers, who exactly taught them the complex rules of mathematics and structural engineering? To even attempt to answer why they built such an impossible structure, we must look away from the heavy stones and look up into the vast, turning night sky. Gobkleet is not just a temple. It is a meticulously calibrated, highly advanced astronomical observatory. The placement of the massive T-shaped pillars is not arbitrary. They are perfectly, deliberately aligned to track the complex, incredibly slow movements of the celestial bodies. The twin central pillars of the main enclosures are positioned to frame specific stars, such as Sirius, and specific constellations like Orion, precisely as they would have appeared on the horizon 11,600 years ago. But one specific pillar holds a message that has sent a chilling ripple through the scientific community. It is known as Pillar 43, or the Vulture Stone. It is covered in a complex, dizzying array of carvings. At the center is a massive vulture holding a strange, perfectly spherical object. Perhaps the sun, or perhaps something else entirely, on its outstretched wing. Below the vulture is a headless human figure, surrounded by scorpions, snakes, and a wolf. For years, researchers were baffled by this chaotic, deeply unsettling imagery. But recently, archaeoastronomers analyzing the vulture stone made a terrifying realization. The animals carved into the stone are not just animals. They are ancient specific symbols for constellations in the night sky. The scorpion represents what we now call Scorpius. The wolf represents Lupus. The vulture represents Sagittarius. When you map the positions of these animal constellations exactly as they are carved on Pillar 43, they correspond perfectly to a highly specific snapshot of the night sky. It is a precise astronomical date stamp, and the date that the vulture stone perfectly depicts is roughly 10,950 years before the birth of Christ. This date is not random. It corresponds exactly to one of the most devastating, violent, and catastrophic climate events in the history of the Earth. The sudden, brutal plunge back into glacial temperatures that caused mass extinctions across the globe. Many researchers now believe that the vulture stone is not just art. It is a desperate, massive, enduring memorial. A physical record carved into solid rock documenting a catastrophic comet strike that darkened the sky and nearly wiped out their world. Think about the profound implications of this. It means these supposedly primitive hunter-gatherers were observing the sky with such meticulous generational precision that they understood the slow 26,000-year cycle of the precession of the equinoxes. They mapped the constellations. They recorded a global catastrophe. They organized a massive workforce to create a colossal stone observatory, specifically designed to carefully record the shifting sky. But the most truly terrifying thing about this place is not how they managed to build it, but what they deliberately chose to do with it afterward. Quebec was not destroyed by a sudden earthquake. It was not burned to the ground by an invading rival tribe. It was not slowly, naturally covered by the gentle, creeping dust of time. After being used, maintained, and revered for perhaps 1,000 years, the ancient builders made a conscious, monumental, and deeply baffling decision. They decided to bury it. They did not simply walk away and abandon the great stone rings to the elements. They organized an effort that was arguably just as massive, just as labor-intensive, and just as deeply coordinated as the original construction of the temple itself. They systematically, painstakingly gathered thousands upon thousands of tons of earth, limestone, rubble, flint tools, and animal bones. Imagine the scene. Lines of thousands of people carrying heavy woven baskets filled with dirt and rock, walking slowly up the hill in the blazing sun. They poured the earth into the sacred rings, slowly filling the perfectly carved acoustic chambers. The dirt rose higher and higher, covering the beautiful, smooth terrazzo floors. It crept up the sides of the massive pillars, slowly swallowing the leaping foxes, the menacing scorpions, and the looming vultures. They continued to pour the rubble until the 18-feet pillars were completely, utterly submerged in the dark earth. They filled every single enclosure, and then they piled even more dirt on top, packing it down until the greatest architectural achievement of the ancient world was completely erased from the visible landscape. They turned their magnificent towering observatory into a completely ordinary, unremarkable, gently sloping hill, and then they walked away. Why would a society spend generations breaking their backs to carve, transport, and erect the most magnificent structure on earth, only to deliberately spend decades breaking their backs to bury it? What could possibly motivate an entire culture to perfectly entomb their most sacred, mathematically precise creation? Some academics suggest it was a ritual decommissioning, a way of retiring a sacred space once it had lost its spiritual power, much like burying a holy artifact. Others suggest it was a way of transitioning from a hunter-gatherer society to an agricultural one, burying the old gods to make way for the new. But given the terrifying apocalyptic astronomical warnings carved into the vulture stone, given the incredible back-breaking effort required to seal the site so perfectly against the ravages of time and weather, a much darker, much more chilling possibility remains. They buried Gobcleat, not as an ordinary grave, but as a desperate heavy time capsule. They were hiding it deep within the earth because they knew exactly what the sky was capable of doing. To understand the sheer paralyzing terror that must have driven our ancestors to bury their greatest architectural masterpiece, we must look at the climate of the earth roughly 12,800 years ago. For thousands of years prior to this exact moment, the planet had been slowly, steadily warming. The great crushing glaciers of the Ice Age were in full retreat, melting away to reveal vast green landscapes. Humanity was expanding, exploring, and settling along the beautiful resource-rich coastlines of the world. The air was growing warmer, the forests were spreading, and life was flourishing in a glorious golden dawn of possibility. And then in the blink of a geological eye, the warming simply stopped. It did not just stop. It violently, aggressively reversed. The earth was thrown back into the freezing, bitter grip of a deep glacial winter. Temperatures in the northern hemisphere plummeted by as much as 15 in a matter of a few short years. This sudden, catastrophic freezing period is known to modern geologists as the Younger Deuce. For decades, scientists stared at the ice core pulled from Greenland, completely baffled by this sudden drop in temperature. The climate of a planetary body the size of the Earth is a massive, incredibly heavy system. It takes thousands of years of subtle orbital shifts to change global temperatures. It behaves like a massive ocean liner, slowly turning over. It does not simply stop and reverse course in a single decade, unless of course it hits something or something hits it. When geologists dig deep into the earth, cutting through the layers of soil that represent the passage of time, they find something deeply unsettling. dating exactly to 12,800 years ago, across North America, parts of Europe, and stretching all the way into the Middle East. There is a distinct, undeniable dark line buried in the dirt. It is called the black mat. Below this dark, thin layer of soil, the earth is filled with the massive bones of woolly mammoths, giant ground sloths, and saber-toothed cats. Below this line, there are the stone spear points of the ancient humans who hunted them. But immediately above this dark layer, the giant animals are completely gone, extinct, wiped from the face of the earth. When scientists placed this black mat layer under powerful electron microscopes, they found materials that simply do not belong on the surface of our planet in such massive concentrations. They found high levels of iridium and platinum, elements that are incredibly rare on Earth, but deeply abundant in asteroids and comets. They found magnetic spherules, tiny, perfectly round droplets of metal that only form when rock is instantly melted and thrown high into the freezing atmosphere. And most terrifying of all, they found millions of nanodiamonds. The climate did not change slowly over thousands of years. It collapsed in a single decade. The black mat layer found across multiple continents is filled with nanodiamonds. What exactly attacked the Earth with enough terrifying force to vaporize solid rock? The leading and most deeply chilling theory is the Younger Dry Impact hypothesis. Imagine the night sky 12,800 years ago. For weeks, a massive, brilliant comet had been growing larger and brighter among the stars, a burning omen approaching from the deep void of space. As it crossed into the gravity well of the Earth, the massive ball of ice and rock fractured into multiple, terrifyingly huge fragments. These fragments did not strike the deep ocean, nor did they leave massive visible craters on the exposed rock of the continents. Instead, the mathematical models suggest that they struck the thickest, most heavily armored part of the planet, the massive, 2 millimeters thick Laurentide ice sheet that covered most of North America. When the comet fragments slammed into the ice sheet, the kinetic energy released was incomprehensible. It was the equivalent of thousands of nuclear weapons detonating simultaneously. The intense, blinding heat of the impact instantly vaporized billions of tons of solid ice, sending a superheated plume of steam and pulverized rock high into the stratosphere, blocking out the sun and triggering the sudden bitter global cooling. But the vaporized ice was only the beginning of the nightmare. The heat of the impact also flash melted a staggering portion of the remaining ice sheet. Millions of gallons of freezing dark fresh water were suddenly violently released from their frozen prison. This water did not gently flow into the rivers. It roared across the North American continent in a mega flood of unimaginable apocalyptic proportions. It carved deep channels through the solid bedrock, tearing up entire forests, sweeping away herds of massive animals and carrying boulders the size of houses as if they were pebbles. When this incomprehensible volume of meltwater finally reached the oceans, it caused a catastrophic disruption of the global sea levels. The oceans did not rise by a few gentle inches over a century. They swelled violently. Massive tidal waves, driven by the sudden influx of water and the tectonic shock waves of the impacts, hammered the coastlines of the world. The fertile, low-lying coastal plains, the exact places where the majority of humanity had gathered, built, and thrived, were suddenly completely submerged. The sea levels rose so incredibly fast that the people living on the coastlines could not simply walk away. The primitive coastal cities and settlements were completely swallowed by the raging tide. But did anyone manage to survive to tell this horrifying story? To find the answer, we do not need to look at rocks or ice cores. We need to look at the stories we tell our children in the dark. We need to look at the ancient myths. For the longest time, modern historians and scholars dismiss the ancient myths of our ancestors as simple fairy tales. We assume that primitive people, frightened by a local river overflowing its banks or a heavy seasonal storm, exaggerated their local weather events into grand dramatic tales of angry gods and global destruction. But when you truly analyze the comparative mythology of the human race, a deeply unsettling, unavoidable pattern emerges. The story of a great world-destroying flood is not localized. It is absolutely global. It is the single most pervasive, universally shared memory of the human species. In the ancient Middle East, thousands of years before the Bible was written, the Sumerians carved the Epic of Gilgamesh into heavy clay tablets. They told the story of Utnapishtim, a man who was warned by the gods of a coming deluge, who built a massive boat to save his family and the seed of all living things from the rising waters. In the ancient Hebrew texts, we find the deeply familiar story of Noah, navigating a drowned world in a wooden ark, while the rains fell and the fountains of the deep burst open. In ancient India, the Vedic texts tell the story of Manu, who was warned by a divine fish of a massive approaching flood that would sweep away all of humanity. Manu builds a ship and is towed to the highest mountains to survive the cleansing of the earth. In the deep jungles of Central America, the Mayan Popol Vuh describes a great flood of dark, heavy resin falling from the sky, accompanied by a deafening roar and the destruction of the previous age of mankind. The indigenous tribes of North America, the Aboriginal peoples of Australia, the isolated islanders of the deep Pacific cultures that were separated by thousands of miles of impossible, deadly oceans, cultures that had absolutely no contact with one another for tens of thousands of years. They all carry the exact same specific, terrifying memory. They speak of a time when humanity grew proud or wicked. They speak of a sudden, terrifying darkness falling across the sky. They speak of fire and burning stars falling from the heavens, striking the earth with a deafening, world-shattering roar. And then they speak of the water, the dark, freezing, unstoppable water that rose up to swallow the valleys, the forests, and eventually the very peaks of the mountains. These are not coincidences. Human imagination is vast, but it is not uniformly identical across the isolated corners of the globe. These stories are the desperate, traumatized, passed-down memories of the ultimate human catastrophe. They are the oral history of the Younger Dryas impact and the sudden violent melting of the ice caps. Every ancient culture, separated by thousands of miles of impassable ocean, tells the exact same chilling story of fire falling from the heavens and dark water rising to cover the mountain peaks. If this is actual recorded history, what exactly did the few survivors manage to carry with them from the ruined old world? Imagine the absolute crushing despair of the survivors. Imagine standing on a high, rocky mountain peak, shivering in the sudden, bitter cold of the new volcanic winter, looking down at a world that is completely covered in dark, muddy, debris-filled water. Everything you knew is gone. Your home, your extended family, the fertile hunting grounds, the sacred sites where your ancestors were buried, the coastal plains are gone. When the floodwaters finally, agonizingly began to recede over the passing decades, the earth was fundamentally changed. The survivors were forced to climb down from the high places and walk into a landscape covered in thick, sterile mud and the rotting carcasses of massive animals. The grand, sprawling coastal settlements of Dogland and Sunderland were lost forever to the crushing depths. The survivors were thrust instantly back into the absolute lowest levels of raw survival. They were reduced to scavengers, shivering in the damp, scraping in the mud for roots, seeking shelter in the dark, cold caves once more. They were living in the Stone Age. But here is the crucial defining difference between these survivors and the truly primitive apes we often imagine. They were living in the Stone Age, but their minds were not made of stone. They were not primitive. They were refugees. They were the traumatized citizens of a shattered world. Within their minds, within the deep folded architecture of their brilliant brains, they carried the ghosts of the world that had drowned. They remembered the old ways. They remembered how to map the turning of the stars. They remembered the intricate complex rules of mathematics required to build massive structures. They remembered the delicate life-giving secrets of the seeds in the soil. But knowledge is a fragile, heavy burden when your hands are bleeding from the cold and your children are starving. You cannot build a megalithic temple when you are desperately tracking a single deer through the snow. You cannot plant a vast, organized field of wheat when the climate is swinging wildly and the ground is frozen solid. So they became the silent keepers of the flame. The elders huddled around the small smoking campfires in the dark, and they spoke. They used their complex language to weave the knowledge of the old world into heavy, memorable stories. They turned history into myth. They turned astronomy into the stories of the gods in the sky. They turned the memory of the great coastal settlements into legends of lost golden paradises. They held on to the fragments of the old world with a desperate, beautiful, heartbreaking tenacity. They passed the secrets down from father to son, from mother to daughter, whispering the old truths in the dark, waiting patiently for the long, bitter winter to end. They were waiting for the ice to finally retreat, waiting for the climate to stabilize, waiting for the earth to heal enough, so that they could finally take the heavy seeds of civilization out of their pockets and plant them in the mud once more. And slowly, painfully, over thousands of years, the earth did heal. The climate of the Holocene era stabilized. The deep, punishing cold of the younger Dryas faded into the warming sun. And the descendants of the survivors, carrying the fragmented, whispered knowledge of their ancestors, finally found themselves in a world where they could breathe, where they could settle, and where they could begin to rebuild. The floodwaters eventually receded, leaving scattered groups holding on to fragments of a shattered world. But those fragments of knowledge, they occasionally echo in the unlikeliest of places and times. To truly understand how fractured and incomplete our timeline is, we have to look closely at the impossible objects that have somehow survived the grinding teeth of time. These are the artifacts that scientists politely call anomalies, but which are, in reality, glaring, undeniable glitches in the matrix of our history. They're objects that possess a level of deep technological sophistication that simply should not exist in the eras where we find them. Let us begin with a heavily corroded, calcified lump of bronze pulled from the salty, freezing depths of the Mediterranean Sea in the early 1900s. Divers, exploring the scattered wreckage of an ancient Roman cargo ship off the coast of the tiny Greek island of Antitha, found what appeared to be a crumbling greenish rock. But decades later, when curious scientists finally placed this artifact under powerful high-resolution X-rays, the stone revealed an absolutely breathtaking, impossible interior. Hidden inside the calcified shell were dozens of beautifully delicate interlocking bronze gears. They were cut with microscopic mathematical precision. It was not a clock. It was a highly advanced, deeply complex mechanical computer. By turning a small hand crank, The user could calculate the precise overlapping orbits of the Sun, the Moon, and the known planets. It could accurately predict lunar and solar eclipses decades in advance. And it even accounted for the deeply subtle, irregular, elliptical orbit of the Moon. A concept of astrophysics that we did not fully mathematically formalize until the times of Isaac Newton. Yet this stunning, intricate machine was built roughly 100 years before the birth of Christ. The absolute, undeniable problem with the Anthera mechanism is that it represents an end product. You do not simply wake up one morning and invent a perfectly functioning multi-guide astronomical computer. This machine implies a long, sprawling, unrecorded tradition of highly advanced mechanical engineering. Yet we have found absolutely no prototype. We have found no simpler, earlier versions. It appears in the historical record, fully formed, like a ghost of advanced technology, and then the knowledge to build such a machine completely disappears from the earth for another 1,500 years. And it is not just impossible machines that haunt our archives. It is also the impossible maps. In the year 1513, an Ottoman admiral and seaographer named Piri Reis compiled a magnificent world map drawn on the delicate dried skin of a gazelle. He noted in the margins that he had compiled his map by copying and assembling much older ancient source maps, some of which dated back to the Library of Alexandria. For centuries, it was just another interesting historical document. But in the mid-9th century, when modern cartographers examined the lower portions of the Piraeus map, their blood ran cold. The map depicts the detailed winding coastline of Antarctica, but it does not show the massive unbroken sheets of white ice that cover the continent today. It perfectly, meticulously depicts the subglacial topography of the landmass, the hidden bays, the deep inlets, the specific mountain ranges exactly as they exist deep beneath the ice. Here is the chilling, insurmountable problem. Antarctica was not even officially discovered by modern explorers until the 1820s. And the last time the actual rocky coastline of Queen Maud Land was free of its heavy, crushing burden of ice was at least 6,000 years ago, long before the supposed invention of the very first written language. An astronomical computer with precise interlocking gears from the year 100 before Christ. A deeply detailed map perfectly drawing the subglacial coastline of Antarctica thousands of years before it was ever supposedly discovered. This incredible, impossible knowledge was not freshly invented by these people. It was clearly inherited, but inherited from whom? The whispers of the ghosts do not only echo in cold bronze and dried parchment. Sometimes the most terrifying, undeniable evidence of lost, highly advanced knowledge is carved directly into the bone of our ancestors. When we think of the Stone Age, we think of dirty, desperate people dying young from simple infections or minor injuries. We certainly do not think of highly organized, complex, and astonishingly successful medical systems. Yet the archaeological record is filled with human skulls dating back 10,000, 12,000, and even 14,000 years ago that bear the unmistakable shocking marks of advanced neurosurgery. This practice is known as trepanation. It involves deliberately, carefully cutting, scraping, or drilling a precise hole through the hard bone of the human skull to expose the delicate dura mater, the protective membrane surrounding the brain. Imagine the sheer, unadulterated terror of this procedure. Imagine laying a patient down on the cold, dirt floor of a cave or a temporary shelter. You have no modern anesthesia. You have no brightly lit sterile surgical theater. You have no stainless steel scalpels. Your only tools are sharp pieces of chipped obsidian or carefully shaped flint. The ancient surgeon had to cut through the skin, pull back the muscle, and then painstakingly endlessly scrape away at the hard bone of the skull, 1 millimeter too deep. One slight slip of the razor-sharp stone and the blade would pierce the brain, causing instant massive hemorrhage and certain death. It requires a flawless, intimate understanding of human anatomy, a perfectly steady hand, and a deeply complex understanding of how to manage bleeding and prevent shock. But the most truly staggering, almost unbelievable fact about prehistoric trepidation is not that they simply tried to do it. It is that they succeeded. When modern osteologists examine these ancient drilled skulls, they do not just see holes. They see smooth, beautifully rounded, healed bone growth around the edges of the cuts. This physical evidence proves without a shadow of a doubt that the patients did not die on the operating table. They survived the invasive, agonizing surgery, and they lived for years, sometimes decades afterward. Some skulls even show evidence of multiple separate surgeries performed years apart, all perfectly healed. When you look at the statistical survival rates of these ancient Stone Age brain surgeries, the numbers are absolutely staggering. Depending on the specific region and era, the survival rate was frequently between 70 and 90%. To put that incredible number into a chilling modern perspective, we must look at the hospitals of the relatively recent past. During the American Civil War in the 1860s, if a soldier suffered a severe head wound and the military doctors had to operate to relieve pressure on the brain, the mortality rate was incredibly high. Despite having metal surgical tools, designated hospitals, and the beginnings of modern medical training, the survival rate for such invasive trauma was often 50% or worse. There were absolutely no modern antibiotics in the Stone Age. There were no brightly lit, perfectly sterile operating rooms. Yet these supposedly primitive, nomadic Stone Age hunters successfully performed incredibly invasive, highly complex open brain surgeries with a survival rate that completely eclipses the doctors of the American Civil War. Where on earth did they learn this highly advanced, deeply specific system of medicine? If we cannot fully explain how our direct ancestors acquired this impossible knowledge, perhaps we need to reconsider the fundamental assumption that they were the only ones figuring things out. Perhaps they were not talking only to each other. For the vast majority of our recorded history, we have suffered from a profound, deep-seated loneliness as a species. Homo sapiens are the only humans left on this planet. We look around and we see no peers, only animals. Because of this absolute isolation, we have arrogantly assumed that the development of technology, of art, and of medicine was our solitary independent achievement. We assumed we walked the long, hard road of evolution entirely alone. But in the year 2010, inside a freezing remote cave in the Ali Mountains of Siberia, that comforting illusion was shattered into 1,000,000 pieces. Scientists excavating the Denisova cave found a tiny, highly fragmented piece of a pinky finger bone belonging to a young girl who lived roughly 40,000 years ago. Because the cave was so incredibly cold, acting like a natural deep freeze, the DNA inside that tiny fragment of bone was miraculously preserved. When geneticists mapped the genome, they expected to find the DNA of an early modern human or perhaps a Neanderthal. Instead, they found a ghost. The DNA did not belong to us, and it did not belong to the Neanderthal. It belonged to an entirely new, entirely separate parallel species of human. We named them the Denisova. We have very few physical fossils of them, just a jawbone, a few teeth, and that single finger bone. We do not know exactly what they look like. We do not know the sound of their voices or the complex structure of their languages, but we know with absolute genetic certainty that they were highly intelligent. We know they crafted beautiful polished jewelry, including a stunning, perfectly drilled bracelet made of green chlorite that requires a high-speed drill to manufacture. And most importantly, we know that they met us. They looked into the eyes of our ancestors. They sat around the same warm campfires in the freezing dark, and they interbred with us. We know this because their ghost DNA is still actively walking the earth today, silently encoded within the blood of modern humans. People living in Melanesia, Papua New Guinea, and Aboriginal Australians carry significant percentages of Denisovan DNA. The indigenous people of the high Tibetan Plateau carry a specific, highly adapted Denisovan gene that alters their blood chemistry, allowing them to breathe easily and thrive in the incredibly thin, oxygen, deprived air of the massive Himalayan mountains. We were never completely alone on this planet. There were at least 3, perhaps 4 or even 5 distinct, completely parallel human species living exactly at the same time as our direct ancestors, possessing equivalent or perhaps even superior intelligence. What exactly happened to their vast accumulated libraries of knowledge when their species finally went extinct? This realization fundamentally aggressively changes the entire narrative of human history. The slow linear progression of technology from simple stone to complex metal, from primitive grunts to complex philosophy, was never a straight line. It was a massive, chaotic, sprawling patchwork. Imagine the incredibly deep, dark nights of the prehistoric world. Imagine a small group of our ancestors, Homo sapiens, exhausted and freezing, stumbling across a camp of Denisovans or Neanderthals. They did not just trade food or animal skins. They traded secrets. Perhaps one species had spent 10,000 years mastering the complex thermal physics of heat-treating stone, while another species had spent 10,000 years perfectly mapping the slow, creeping movements of the stars. Perhaps one species had developed a deep, almost magical understanding of medicinal plants and the highly complex anatomy of the human brain, while another had mastered the deep-sea currents and the art of coastal navigation. When the great apocalyptic climate disasters struck, when the volcanic winters darkened the sky and the massive floods drowned the coastlines, entire species of humans were wiped off the biological map forever. The Neanderthals vanished. The Denisovans vanished. The mysterious ghost populations of Africa vanished. But their knowledge did not necessarily die with them. If they had shared their secrets, if they had whispered their ancient hard-won truths around the shared campfires before the dark times came, then their knowledge survived. It was carried forward, clutched desperately in the hands of the sole surviving species, us. We are not the proud, independent inventors of everything we see around us. We are the ultimate scavengers. We are the inheritors of a massive, fractured, shattered world. We picked up the tools left behind by the dead. We memorized the stories of the flooded cities. We inherited the astronomical maps from people whose names we can no longer pronounce. We took the fragmented, broken pieces of a dozen different lost cultures and multiple extinct human species, and we slowly, painfully stitched them together into something we arrogantly call human civilization. All these glaring, impossible paradoxes, the sunken ruins rotting at the bottom of the sea, the massive astronomically aligned pillars deliberately buried in the dirt, the impossible bronze machines calculating the stars, they all point toward a single, humbling, and deeply terrifying truth about who we really are. We must now return to the very beginning of our journey tonight. We must look back into that terrifying, gaping abyss of time that we spoke of in the opening moments. That vast, dark, silent canyon of 290,000 years, where our anatomically modern ancestors supposedly wandered aimlessly, doing absolutely nothing of consequence. For generations, we have been taught to view that massive stretch of time as a quiet, empty waiting room. We were told that humanity was simply sitting in the dark, waiting patiently for the climate to warm, waiting for the sudden, miraculous inspiration to plant a seed, waiting to finally step out onto the brightly lit stage of recorded history. But the sunken stones and the shattered DNA tell a completely different story. That vast canyon of time was never an empty waiting room. It was a sprawling, chaotic, magnificent, and tragic theater of rise and fall. Human history is not a neat, straight, constantly ascending line marching proudly from the dark caves to the bright modern cities. It is a circle, or rather, it is a series of broken, repeating cycles. We did not simply wait. Over those hundreds of thousands of years, our brilliant, capable ancestors likely rose up out of the dirt, organized themselves, observed the delicate turning of the cosmos, and built incredible, beautiful things. They reached localized peaks of high culture, profound philosophy, and sophisticated environmental engineering. And then the Earth, in its chaotic, violent indifference, pressed the reset button. The ice advanced, the supervolcanoes erupted, the comets struck, and the dark waters rose. The civilizations were violently shattered, swept away, and buried under thousands of tons of freezing mud and volcanic ash. The few traumatized survivors were forced back down to the absolute bottom of the survival ladder, clutching only fragments of memories, passing down stories of golden ages and angry gods that eventually faded into the mists of pure myth. We are not the first pinnacle of humanity. We are simply the current version. We suffer from a profound collective amnesia, staring blankly at the magnificent, impossible works of our ancient ancestors and calling it magic. This realization is deeply humbling. It strips away the comforting arrogance of the modern world. We sit in our climate-controlled homes, staring at our glowing digital screens, entirely convinced that we are the absolute masters of the earth, permanently immune to the cycles of destruction that claimed the ancients. We look at our towering skyscrapers of glass and reinforced steel, our sprawling, interconnected global internet, and our massive concrete highways, and we believe that our legacy is permanent, etched into the crust of the planet forever. But let us conduct a quiet, sobering thought experiment in the dark. Let us imagine the sheer fragility of our current modern world. Imagine if the sky were to suddenly change tomorrow. Imagine a new catastrophic solar flare, or a sudden dramatic shift in the magnetic poles, or another massive impact from the dark void of space. The delicate, highly complex electrical grid that sustains our entire global civilization would collapse in a matter of hours. Without power, the massive pumps that keep our coastal cities dry would fail, and the dark sea would slowly, inevitably rush into the streets of New York, London, and Tokyo. If humanity were forced to suddenly abandon our great cities and regress to basic survival, how long would our magnificent modern world actually last without us to constantly maintain it? The answer is terrifyingly brief. Without constant daily human intervention, nature is a ruthless, incredibly efficient eraser. Within a single year, thick creeping vines and heavy grasses would tear through the asphalt of our highways. Within a H100 red years, the massive steel support cables of our greatest suspension bridges would rust completely through, sending the heavy structures crashing silently into the rivers below. Within 500 years, the towering glass skyscrapers, subjected to the endless, unyielding cycles of freezing winters and expanding ice, would shatter and collapse into massive piles of twisted, rusting metal and crumbling concrete. In 1,000 years, the concrete itself would begin to dissolve back into the basic raw minerals of the earth. And what of our knowledge? Our libraries are no longer carved in heavy, enduring stone. Our greatest scientific achievements, our deepest philosophies, our entire recorded history is stored as delicate, invisible magnetic charges on highly fragile digital hard drives and delicate silicon servers. Without electricity, that knowledge evaporates instantly, vanishing into the air like a phantom. Even our printed paper books would rot, turn to mold, and disintegrate into dust within a few short centuries. Perhaps a thick, microscopic layer of degraded microelastics would remain trapped in the geological strata. Perhaps the heavy radioactive isotopes buried deep inside our sealed nuclear waste facilities would linger. But the grand sweeping architecture of who we were would be completely, utterly erased. If our world were to suddenly collapse tomorrow, what exactly would future archaeologists find in 50,000 years? Would they uncover the truth of our towering cities? Or would they just simply assume that we were nothing more than simple gatherers wandering the plains? It is a heavy thought, a thought that makes the walls of our modern world feel incredibly thin, like a fragile paper lantern glowing in a vast, dark, and highly unpredictable storm. It makes you realize how utterly small we are in the face of deep geological time. But as you lie there in the dark, listening to the quiet, steady rhythm of my voice, I want you to gently shift your focus. I want you to let go of the existential dread. I want you to let the fear of the dark canyon simply wash away, dissolving into the quiet night. Because within this sprawling, tragic story of repeated apocalypses and lost civilizations, there is a core, undeniable truth that is profoundly, overwhelmingly beautiful. Stop wondering about what was lost. Stop searching the shadows for the ghosts of the drowned cities. Instead, feel the slow, steady beating of your own heart in your chest. Feel the warm, continuous breath entering and leaving your lungs. That heartbeat, that simple, rhythmic, biological pulse, is the ultimate triumphant counterargument to the cruelty of the universe. The true, enduring legacy of human history is not the massive 16-tenon limestone pillars of Göbekli. It is not the intricate, impossibly complex bronze gears of the Antikythera mechanism. It is not the towering glass skyscrapers of the 21st century. The true legacy is you, the biological hardware resting quietly inside your skull. The very blood flowing through your relaxed veins is the most highly advanced, perfectly tested survival mechanism on the face of the earth. Think about the unbroken, continuous chain of life that had to survive for you to be here tonight. Every single one of your direct ancestors was a survivor. When the skies over Indonesia turned black with suffocating volcanic ash 74,000 years ago, and the global temperatures plunged into a bitter, freezing winter that killed the massive beasts of the plains, your ancient grandmother and grandfather did not simply lay down in the snow and surrender to the dark. They fought. They huddled together around a flickering, desperate fire, sharing their warmth, protecting their young, and refusing to let the flame of humanity extinguish. When the brilliant, terrifying comets struck the ice sheets of North America 12,800 years ago, and the massive continent drowning floods roared across the lands, sweeping away the ancient coastal paradises, your ancestors did not drown. They climbed to the high ground. They built the boats. They held on to the vital fragments of knowledge, and they started over in the mud and the ruin. Completely undeterred by the cruelty of the resetting world. Through ice ages and volcanic winters, through catastrophic floods and the silent, terrifying stretches of famine, they adapted, they learned, they remembered. They passed the spark of life forward, hand to freezing hand, across the hundreds of thousands of years, specifically so that one day you could exist. You do not need to be afraid of the deep time. You do not need to fear the resetting of the clock. You are the direct, unbroken descendant of those who survived the ice ages, the supervolcanoes, and the great world-shattering floods. You are safe. You are resting perfectly safe in a warm, quiet room. The world outside your window is calm. The long, brutal winter is over. The floodwaters receded thousands of years ago. You are the living, breathing culmination of hundreds of thousands of years of absolute, unyielding resilience. So just breathe. Let the heavy weight of history fall away from your shoulders. Let the mysteries of the sunken cities and the buried stones fade into the background like a soft, comforting mist. The ghosts of our brilliant lost ancestors are not haunting us. They are watching over us, whispering quietly in our DNA, reminding us that no matter how dark the sky becomes, the morning always eventually returns. As your body sinks deeper and deeper into the mattress, as the muscles in your face, your shoulders, and your legs completely relax and let go of the tension of the day, allow your mind to drift freely across that vast ancient landscape. You are a part of something incredibly old, incredibly strong, and deeply universally connected. If this journey through the forgotten chapters of our past has brought you a sense of quiet peace tonight, let me know. Before you completely surrender to the heavy pulling tide of sleep, you can leave a soft whisper in the comments below. Tell me where you are resting in the world. Tell me the exact time the clock shows in your quiet room. Join the invisible global tribe of dreamers, who are all closing their eyes at different hours under the exact same ancient turning stars, sharing the exact same profound, beautiful mystery of our existence. And if you want to drift away with me again into another forgotten corner of the past, simply subscribe to the channel and I will be here waiting in the quiet whenever you need to find some peace. But for now, there is nothing left to solve. There is nothing left to build, and nothing left to uncover. The long, hard work of the day is completely finished. Just focus on the slow, even rhythmic rise and fall of your chest. Inhale the calm, quiet air of the present. Exhale the heavy, ancient dust of the past. Rise and fall like the gentle, ancient tides of the forgotten seas. Like the slow breathing cycles of the empires of old. Rise and fall. You are deeply, perfectly safe. The ancient watchfires are burning brightly in the distance, keeping the absolute dark at bay. It is time to let go. It is time to let the quiet take over. Sleep well, traveler. Sleep deeply, and good night.